The Dangerous Decline of Israel Foreign Policy. Stephen M. Walt is a foreign policy columnist and professor of international affairs at Harvard University. After decades of failure, the Zionist project is failing to protect itself. Israel is in deep trouble. Its people are deeply divided and the situation is unlikely to improve. It is also mired in a stalemate in Gaza, with the military showing signs of strain, and a wider war with Hezbollah or Iran still a possibility. Israel's economy is in dire straits, with the Times of Israel recently reporting that as many as 60,000 businesses could close this year. Moreover, Israel's recent actions have severely damaged its global image and made it a pariah in ways that were previously unimaginable. Following the brutal Hamas attacks of October 7, 2023, Israel received considerable and appropriate sympathy from around the world, and it seemed to be accepted that Israel had the right to respond forcefully. But just over 10 months later, Israel's genocidal campaign against Palestinians in Gaza and escalating Israeli settler violence in the West Bank have squandered that initial wave of support. The chief prosecutor of the International Criminal Court has applied for arrest warrants for Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and Defense Minister Yoav Gallant on charges of war crimes and crimes against humanity. The International Court of Justice has presented preliminary findings that Israel's actions were genocidal in nature and intent, and it has also declared that Israel's occupation and colonization of the West Bank, Gaza, and East Jerusalem are in clear violation of international law. Only the staunchest defenders of Zionism can look at what is happening in Gaza without feeling confused, if not horrified. Support for Israel's actions in the United States is plummeting, and younger Americans, including many young Jewish Americans, have protested the Biden administration's tepid response to Israel's actions. Read this tweet from Eran Etzion, former vice chairman of Israel's National Security Council, to better understand the damage Israel has done to itself. Then read the account of a recent visit to Israel by historian Omer Bartov, one of the world's leading Holocaust scholars, and you'll understand how deep the problem runs. It's easy to pin all the blame on Netanyahu, and he deserves criticism at home and abroad. But blaming Bibi misses a much deeper issue, the erosion of Israel's strategic thinking over the past 50 years. The country's achievements and tactical prowess in the first 2 decades after independence tend to obscure, especially among older people, the extent to which Israel's major strategic choices since 1967 have undermined its own security. The early Zionists and the first generation of Israeli leaders were all astute strategists. They attempted the near impossible, to create a Jewish state in the midst of the Arab world, even though the Jewish population in Palestine was tiny in 1900 and they were still a minority when Israel was founded in 1948. The founders succeeded by being ruthlessly realistic, taking advantage of favorable conditions, building a capable paramilitary force, and then a first-rate army and air force, and finding ways to win the support of the world's dominant powers. Recall, for example, that both the Soviet Union and the United States supported the 1947 United Nations partition plan and recognized Israel soon after its creation. David Ben-Gurion and his fellow Zionist leaders were often willing to accept temporary arrangements that did not advance their long-term goals, as long as they brought them closer to their ultimate goals. After achieving statehood, the new government worked diligently to shore up international support through relentless hasbara, propaganda, and building cooperative alliances with France, South Africa, and several other countries. Most importantly, it established a special relationship with the United States, based largely on the growing power and influence of the Israel lobby. Israel's early leaders understood that a small nation surrounded by hostile forces had to calculate carefully and work hard to win international support. Savvy diplomacy and a considerable capacity for deception also helped Israel develop an arsenal of the secret nuclear program, and the obfuscation of the brutal realities of Israel's founding were not widely known until the work of Benny Morris, Elon Papp, Avi Shlaim, Singha Flipan, and other new historians in the 1980s. No government is perfect, and Israel's early leaders sometimes made mistakes. Ben-Gurion erred in colluding with Britain and France to attack Egypt during the Suez Crisis of 1956 and later suggested that Israel might not withdraw. However, he quickly abandoned his position when the Eisenhower administration made it clear that it would not tolerate such unwarranted expansion. But overall, the strategic acumen of the early Zionist state was impressive, especially when compared to its rivals. The turning point was Israel's stunning victory in the 1967 Arab-Israeli War. The outcome was not as good as thought at the time. American intelligence had predicted an easy Israeli victory, but the speed and scale of the victory took many by surprise and helped foster a sense of arrogance that has undermined Israel's strategic decision-making ever since. The main mistake, as astute Israeli scholars have pointed out, was the decision to retain, occupy, and eventually colonize the West Bank and Gaza, as part of a long-term effort to create a Greater Israel. Ben-Gurion and his lieutenants sought to reduce the number of Palestinians living in the new Jewish state, but the occupation of the West Bank and Gaza meant that Israel now controlled a rapidly growing Palestinian population, roughly equal to the Jewish population in Israel. The subsequent occupation created an inevitable tension between Israel's Jewish character and its democratic system. Israel could only remain a Jewish state by suppressing Palestinian political rights and creating an apartheid system, in an era when such a political order was abhorrent to much of the world. Israel could have solved this problem through ethnic cleansing and/or additional genocide, but both would be crimes against humanity that no true friend of Israel could endorse. Other mistakes followed the decision to pursue a Greater Israel. Israeli leaders, and their American counterparts, including Henry Kissinger, missed numerous signs that Egyptian President Anwar Sadat was willing to make peace in exchange for the Sinai Peninsula, which Israel had captured in 1967. Furthermore, Israeli intelligence mistakenly believed that the Egyptian army was too weak to challenge the Israel Defense Forces, IDF, in the Sinai, and thus did not dare to launch a war. The result of this misjudgment was the October War of 1973. Despite initial setbacks, Israel gradually gained the upper hand on the battlefield, but it did not gain the upper hand at the post-war negotiating table. The cost of war, combined with pressure from the United States, convinced Israeli leaders to begin serious negotiations to give up the Sinai. This change in thinking eventually led to Sadat's historic trip to Jerusalem, the Camp David Accords, and the subsequent peace treaty between Egypt and Israel, with the persistent and skillful mediation of then-US President Jimmy Carter. Unfortunately, because then Israeli Prime Minister Menachem Begin was deeply committed to the goal of Greater Israel and unwilling to end the occupation, he missed a promising opportunity to settle the Palestinian issue once and for all. The next clear sign of the erosion of strategic judgment was Israel's brief invasion of Lebanon in 1982. The plan was the brainchild of hawkish Defense Minister Ariel Sharon, who convinced Begin that a military strike would disintegrate the Palestine Liberation Organization, PLO, which had a significant presence in Lebanon, pave the way for a pro-Israeli government in Beirut, and give Israel a free hand in the West Bank. The invasion was a short-term military success, but it led to the IDF's occupation of southern Lebanon, which in turn led directly to the creation of Hezbollah, whose increasingly fierce resistance eventually forced Israel to withdraw from Lebanon in 2000. And the removal of the PLO from Lebanon did not stop Palestinian resistance. Instead, it paved the way for the First Intifada in 1987, another clear sign that the Palestinians would not abandon their homeland or accept permanent Israeli subjugation. Although many visionary Israelis recognized that the Palestinian issue would not go away, successive Israeli governments continued to act in ways that made matters worse. For example, although the PLO accepted Israel's existence by signing the first Oslo Accords in 1993, no Israeli leader was ever willing to offer Palestinians a state of their own. While then Prime Minister Ehud Barak's supposedly generous offer at the 2000 Camp David summit went further than any previous Israeli proposal, it still fell short of providing the Palestinians with a real state. Israel's best offer was to create 2 or 3 separate, demilitarized areas in the West Bank, with Israel retaining full control over the borders, airspace, and water resources of the new entity. This is not a real state, let alone one that a Palestinian leader could accept. It is no wonder that former Israeli Foreign Minister Shlomo Ben-Ami later admitted, "If I were a Palestinian, I would reject Camp David." Reconciliation with the Palestinians requires Israel to stop expanding settlements in the occupied territories, and to work with the Palestinians to establish a competent, effective, and legitimate government. But Israel's leaders, particularly the governments led by Sharon and Netanyahu, did the opposite. They refused to halt settlement expansion, did everything they could to weaken and divide the Palestinians even if it meant tacitly supporting Hamas, and repeatedly thwarted U.S. efforts to achieve a two-state solution. The result was a series of destructive but inconclusive clashes, such as Operation Cast Lead in 2008 to 2009 and Operation Protective Edge in 2014. These repeated, mowing the lawn, efforts failed to end Palestinian resistance, however, and tensions eventually culminated in Hamas's cross-border attack on October 7, the worst blow to Israel in decades. A final example of Israel's strategic short-sightedness is its vehement opposition to any international effort to negotiate limits on Iran's nuclear program. For legitimate strategic reasons, Israel wants to remain the only nuclear-armed state in the Middle East and does not want to see Iran, its top regional rival, acquire a bomb. If so, Netanyahu and other Israeli leaders should have been pleased and relieved when the United States and other world powers convinced Iran to sign the 2015 Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action. Why? Because it required Tehran to reduce its uranium enrichment capacity, reduce its stockpile of enriched uranium, and accept comprehensive inspections from the International Atomic Energy Agency, putting a nuclear bomb out of Iran's reach for a decade or more. Many senior Israeli security officials wisely supported the deal, but Netanyahu and his hardline supporters, along with AIPAC and the more hawkish groups in the U.S.-Israel lobby, were adamantly opposed. This group of hardliners played a key role in convincing then-US President Donald Trump to leave the deal in 2018, and today Iran is closer than ever to building a bomb. It is hard to imagine a more short-sighted policy. What might explain the dramatic decline in Israel's strategic capabilities? A key factor is the sense of arrogance and impunity that comes from America's constant protection and respect for Israel's wishes. If the most powerful country in the world supports you no matter what you do, the need to think carefully before you act is bound to diminish. Israel's tendency to see itself as the victim and blame anti-Semitism for any opposition to its policies has also not helped, as it prevents Israeli leaders and the public from realizing that their own actions have caused the hostility they face. Netanyahu's rule as Israel's longest-serving prime minister is another aspect of the problem, especially since his actions are largely driven by personal gain, avoiding jail time for corruption, not by a desire to do what is best for his country. Add to that the growing influence of religious messianic views on foreign policy that were recently summarized in a chilling article in Haaretz. They are a recipe for disaster. When any country starts making strategic decisions based on doomsday prophecies and expectations of divine intervention, beware. Why does this matter? Because as the Americans demonstrated in their own response to 9/11, countries that do not think carefully about their strategic choices can do significant harm to themselves and others. Israel's actions threaten its own long-term prospects, so anyone who wants Israel to have a bright future should be particularly concerned about its declining ability to judge for itself. Strategy. Israel's vengeful and short-sighted actions have caused enormous harm to innocent Palestinians for decades and continue to this day, yet they have done little to end Palestinian resistance. Being tied to an erratic and unthinking partner is also a serious problem for the United States, because it will continue to suck up time, attention, and resources, and make the United States look both ineffective and hypocritical. It could also inspire another wave of anti-American terrorism, with all the obvious damage that would result. Unfortunately, I'm not sure how to fix this situation. The best that Israel's supporters in the United States can do is to pressure both Democrats and Republicans to take a tough stance on the Jewish state so that it begins to reconsider its current trajectory. Of course, that would require lobbying groups like AIPAC to reflect on their own role in getting Israel into its current predicament. Unfortunately, there is no sign that will happen anytime soon. Instead, Israel and its supporters in the United States are continuing to gamble, a gamble that is sure to lead to continued trouble, and even disaster. Stephen M. Walt is a foreign policy columnist and a professor of international relations at Harvard University.